Good morning and welcome to the weekly reminder. My name is Lauren Hall and I hope that you're having a wonderful week in this hot and humid Houston weather, right? I hope that you're staying hydrated and also wearing your mask. Now, today, as you know, July is BIPOC month, Black Indigenous People of Color month. As mentioned in the previous episode, this month brings awareness to the struggles and experiences underrepresented groups face regarding mental illness in the United States. Today, I have a great topic for parents, guardians, and caregivers. Let's talk about having the talk. How to have the conversation about race with your children and teens, and how to start that important conversation and keep it going. What do you think is the appropriate age to discuss race? Are your children too young to talk about race? Does silence about race reinforce racism? In the wake of a national movement in response to racial injustice and police violence against Black and Brown Americans, many parents are now grappling with how to begin or continue the conversation with their children and teens about racism. It can be hard to talk to your children about racism. Some parents worry about exposing their children to issues like racism and discrimination at too young of an age. Others may shy away from talking about something they may not fully understand or don't feel comfortable discussing. Yet, parents of color who have experienced racism simply do not have such choices. Parents have to be willing to go beyond silencing the discussion. The reality is we have a painful history, and sometimes we have an even more painful present. In this moment, our silence will not help us. We have to have the conversations. In the face of frightening and terrible images and themes in the news, kids need to be reassured that their parents and other caregivers will do everything they can to keep them safe. The fact that some youth, however, are less safe than others on the outside world due to their race presents an opportunity to teach our kids about injustice. It is also an opportunity for children to develop empathy, compassion, and citizenship, learning about the role that family can have on improving our society. Parents need to help their children think and talk about our country's racial inequalities as a step towards creating a more equal society. It's important to have these conversations in ways that will give kids the information and support they need while also being responsive to the child's developmental stages. So how do children learn about racial bias? Children learn about racial differences and racial biases from an early age and learn from their first teachers, their parents, how to deal with and react to these differences. The process of learning racial biases is a lot like learning a new language. According to childrenscommunityschools.org, babies get messages about race from the time they are born. At birth, babies look at faces of all races. At 3 months, babies look more at faces that matches their race of their caregivers. By kindergarten, children show more of the same racial attitudes held by adults in their own culture. Thus, they have already learned to associate some groups with higher status than others based on their environment, which means social learning as well as cognitive development of children are essential factors in how children develop racial attitudes. At the age of 5 to 7, explicit conversations about interracial friendships can dramatically impede their racial attitudes as little as a single week. Thus, we have to think critically about how to counteract the effects that racism will have on our children from a very young age. In response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Jane Elliott devised the controversial and startled blue eyes, brown eyes exercise with her third grade students. This now famous exercise labeled participants as inferior and superior based solely upon the color of their eyes and exposed them to the experience of being a minority. This experience was vital in teaching children to counter stereotypes before they became full-fledged, lasting prejudice, and to recognize that every human being has the right to be treated with respect. So what are strategies to help children deal with racial biases? There are 3 strategies that parents can use to help their children deal with racial biases. 1, talk to your children and acknowledge that racial differences and biases exist. Encourage your children to challenge racial stereotypes and racial biases by being kind and compassionate when interacting with people of all racial and cultural groups. A pivotal thing is parents have to confront their own biases. For some parents, the world you grew up in is much different from today. Interracial differences. Thus, you have a responsibility to confront your own racial bias so that your example is consistent with the messages of racial and ethnic tolerance. Before having the conversation with your children, identify and correct your own racial bias thoughts, feelings, and actions, because we all have biases. So what are some tips for talking about racial differences and racism? Talking about race is not racist. It's okay. It's important to have these conversations. From a young age, children may have questions about racial differences, and parents must be prepared to answer them. And no, parents don't have all the answers, and neither do we, right? But it's important to keep your child's developmental readiness in mind. So for preschoolers, at this age, recognize and celebrate differences. If your child asks about someone's skin color, you can use it as an opportunity to acknowledge that people do indeed look different, but to point out things that we all have in common. So you could say, we're all human, but we're all unique. Isn't that amazing, right? Being open and using fairness. Children, especially around 5, tend to understand the concept of fairness quite well. Talk about racism as unfair and unacceptable, and that's why we need to work together to make it better. So for my 6 to 11-year-olds, children this age are better at talking about their feelings and are eager for answers. They are also becoming more exposed to information that they may find hard to process. So start by understanding what they know. Be curious, listen, and ask questions is the first step. Discuss the media together. Social media and the internet may be your child's main source of information, especially in these times of quarantine and social distancing. Our social media and internet is our children's main access to information. Talk openly. Have honest and open discussions about racism, diversity, inclusiveness. Build trust with your children. It encourages them to come to you with questions and worries. Now for my high schoolers, these are my go-to, right? Teenagers are able to understand abstract concepts more clearly and express their views. They may know more than you think they do and have strong emotions about the topic. Try to understand how they feel and what they know and keep the conversation going. It's vital, especially for teens and high schoolers, parents, to create that space of safeness, of openness, of vulnerability and acceptance. Even if you don't like their thoughts or their opinions, right? Just creating that space allows them to be free to express and share with you their thoughts. Know what they know. Find out what your children know about racism and discrimination. Ask them, what have they heard in the news about at their school, their friends? Have they encountered any racism? Have they witnessed racism? Have they had an incident where they struggle to understand the situation in front of them? Ask questions. Find opportunities as events in the news for conversation about children about racism. Check in with them. Have these conversations, right? Ask what they think and introduce them to different perspectives to help expand their understanding. Encourage action. Being active on social media is important for many teens. And as I said earlier, as parents, you may have grew up in a world that's much different, right? And so even being able to have this conversation with your children can also help you learn and help expand your perspective as well. Be able to continue to check in and see how your children are doing. We think that our teens are self-sufficient, but it's important to be observant of signs of numbness, that they may be trying to relieve anxiety, stress, depression, frustration, and anger, right? Parents, it's important to be able to differentiate what is normal adolescent behavior versus abnormal behavior, especially during these times. Our teens are processing the same information as we are, and sometimes they have a hard time of trying to process all of the information in a certain context, and they may not know how to properly process these events, much like we do. If you notice changes in their moods, ask questions. If they are consuming too much social media, compromise on limiting their usage. The conversation about racism lays the groundwork for your child to accept and respect everyone's differences and similarities. As children mature, the answers to questions will become more complex. These are moments to learn what your child understands or is struggling to understand about racial bias. The conversation of racism is an ongoing discussion for families, not a one-off talk. And yes, it can be difficult. It can be challenging, right? But being able to utilize your resources to educate yourself and just have that discussion as a family. We need to educate and inform ourselves and have these conversations thoroughly and with hearts of compassion and understanding. Remember, to create a culture of inclusiveness, we all must look at and acknowledge our biases so we can do something about the ones that are unfair and cause harm to others, like racial biases. Understanding the way people feel about and behave towards those outside our own groups can help communities heal after tragedies, as well as prevent future ones, right? I think in this time of Corona and this pandemic and staying at home, it is, this time has really allowed us to sit still and really reflect on our ideas, our thoughts, our beliefs, right? And it's such a perfect time to really reflect and do some digging, do some internal digging and have these conversations, because we can no longer ignore them, right? When we try to silence them or ignore them, we're only shunning what these issues are. And we live in a world where there's so many different things and so many different people and backgrounds, and we have to be conscious of that and remain vigilant. So please have these conversations, parents. I know it can be tough, but there's so many good resources out there. 2 good resources that I love, that I myself have been reading and researching, is called raceconscious.org. Wonderful tools and resources if parents are struggling to kind of start the conversation, or even for little kids. There is booksforlittles.com. Amazing books that talk about diversity, that talks about racism, that puts it in perspective for the developmental levels of our kids. So please make sure you really just think about these conversations that you have for your kids, and don't be afraid. And yes, you won't have all the answers, but it's just starting the conversation and putting it out there and being transparent. All right. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Thank you again for tuning in, talking about race. I know it can be difficult. I know it can be challenging, but you can do it. Please, please, please. We have an awesome adolescent online group that is beneficial for our high schoolers. Please sign up. It's free. You can do it in the comfort of your home. Please sign up at Support Group Central /Remind for our adolescents, as well as for adults. We have support groups. It's a great resource to stay connected and feel related to those who are going through the same things that we're going through. All right. Please stay safe. Wear your mask. Stay hydrated. It's going to be a hot weekend. Please visit our website at remindsupport.org, and I'll see you next week. Have a great day.